Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Hi, everyone. I'm Janine Turner. Welcome to Constitutional Chats, and come on in virtually. We have a very exciting show for you today, talking about this Federalist Paper 62. I'm very into this paper. We're going to have a great time. Welcome to Constitutional Chats with me, Janine Turner, Kathy Gillespie, Tova Kaplan, and Dakari Chapman. So come on in. Are we going to do our little poll first? Or ask how old everybody is today? We always do it. Oh, I'm getting a no. I'm confused. We always put up a little poll asking how old you are, but I guess we're not doing it today. Okay, so come on in and welcome to the show. I'm Janine Turner. I am an actress by trade, but I'm also the founder and co-president of Constituting America. Kathy Gillespie isn't with us today, but she is co-president, and without Kathy Gillespie, this foundation would never even gotten off the ground. Tova Kaplan, she is just the most amazing 16-year-old you'll ever meet in your life. She's a co-host with us. Tova is 16 and she lives in Illinois. She currently serves as our National Youth Director for Constituting America. It's a big position. And she runs the National Youth Advisory Council like a CEO. I like to brag on her. A top CEO, a top 100 CEO. She is a 3-time winner of our We the Future contest. Great thing for your kids to be doing this summer. She won for the entrepreneurial category when she was in middle school, where she created a marketing plan. The next year, she won for PSA, a wonderful public service announcement. Know your rights, read the Constitution. And this year, she won for STEM, where she created an app. She is the epitome of left brain, right brain, brilliant. She's passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. And once you get to know Tova today, you will just realize there is hope for the country. Welcome, Tova Kaplan.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm so happy to be here and can't wait to get into this topic.
Great. Okay, and now normally I would introduce Dakari Chapman, who is our Constituting America student ambassador, but he's not with us today. So in lieu of that, I'm going to introduce Peter Roff, who is our special guest host today. Peter is a dear, dear friend. And I always joke, he's so brilliant, you don't ever want to play Trivial Pursuit with Peter Roff. Peter Roff is a Newsweek contributor and has written extensively about politics and the American experience for U.S. News and World Report, the United Press International, UPI, and other publications. Constituting America is honored to have Peter as a mentor, judge, and longtime believer in Constituting America and our mission. Peter Roth was there the day we launched this. Welcome, Peter Roth.
It's good to be with everyone.
There, the green square, which
I love Constituting America. I was there at the birth.
You were there at the birth.
I was the obstetrician.
Where would we be without you, Peter, in all seriousness? It's been such a mentor of mine. Okay, now our special guest for our hot topic today, which is Federalist Paper 62, and it talks about why the laws should not be voluminous, which includes the bills should not be voluminous. And I wrote a petition about this, so we're going to have a lot of fun. But our special guest today is Professor Knippenberg. The K is not silent. It's so cool. So hello, Professor Knippenberg, and he has written essays for Constituting America's 90-day study, and one of which was for Federalist 62. Joseph M. Knippenberg is professor of politics at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia. Joseph received his BA from Michigan State, plus his MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. He has published widely on topics in political philosophy, constitutional law, and higher education. He currently sits on the board of the Association for Core Text and Courses, served as vice chair of the Georgia Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and on the board of the American Academy of Liberal Education. He and his wife currently live in Brookhaven, Georgia. Welcome, Professor Knippenberg.
Hello, how are you?
Great. Well, thanks for being with us here today. And we're all going to take turns at, most of us asking questions. But first, I know you have a little opening statement to educate all of us about Federalist 62.
Okay, I'm not going to talk so much about the details of Federalist 62, which has to do largely with James Madison's attempt to defend the existence of the United States Senate. I'm taking as my mandate your concern with long laws, and I'm going to start with let's say a dissident note. And my dissident note is that I'm not in principle opposed to long laws. I am in principle, but let's see how do I want to put this. Long laws work. Long laws are desirable if your legislator is perfectly good and perfectly wise. So if you think of the Mosaic Law in the Old Testament, long laws, lots of laws, but God's the lawgiver. Or if you think of the philosopher kings in Plato's Republic, if you have a perfectly wise, perfectly good lawgiver, you want long laws, or you don't object to long laws. But in our circumstances, we have neither perfectly good nor perfectly wise lawgivers. And I don't mean to slander or libel anyone by saying that. As James Madison says in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And if angels were to govern men, no limitations on government would be necessary. But what we have is non-angelic human beings governing non-angelic human beings. And that's where laws are, and especially long laws, are problematical. So what's wrong with a non-angelical human being governing? Well, first of all, we're not perfectly wise. If we're not perfectly wise, we can make mistakes in the substance of the law. We can get the phenomenon wrong. We can overgeneralize, or we can not be prepared for the accidents that come along. So in some sense, you obviously want to have laws, but laws made by someone other than God, let's say, are going to be imperfect. And how do you deal with this lack of knowledge in law? And the short answer for me is you make as few laws as possible. You have government doing as little as it can conceivably do, because leaving us as free as we can be to judge our own circumstances. We don't rely on the wisdom of someone else. We rely on our own wisdom. And if we make mistakes, we can correct them for ourselves. And if we make mistakes, we're the ones, and probably only us, who suffer the consequences of that. So in that respect, Madison's critique of voluminous legislation implies also an assumption that you're going to have as little law as you could possibly have, certainly at the federal level and probably also at the state level. Now, in terms of, you might say, legislative self-dealing, which was much of the focus of the white paper on voluminous laws that Janine co-authored. What do you do there? It seems to me, again, the more you have government do, the more opportunity is for people to figure out ways of using government authority to make us do what serves their interests rather than the public good. My question for us, and the challenge I think we face now, is that in some sense we expect an awful lot of government. We expect government to do this, that, and the other thing. And when it does, it's hard to get something done unless you give lots of different constituencies a stake in the outcome, which is why we get all these very complicated laws with subsections dealing with different sorts of interests here and there. The only way out of that, it seems to me, again, is deciding we're going to expect less of government. Short of that, I think, again, what it depends upon is what the founders would always call a kind of vigilant citizenry, who holds our legislators accountable, and they're easier held accountable if we know very well what they're doing. So I certainly applaud the effort to force us to write short, intelligible laws, but I'm wondering how successful and how effective that can be. I think I've said enough to start us off here.
Thank you, Professor. Well, I think that why I wrote my Truth Act, we have these bills that are thousands of pages long that no one understands. And the horror is that our senators and legislators, which I think you were talking about, Professor, they can't even understand them. And so this was my bill here, since this is up. This was my petition. I always encourage students to write a petition. That's one of the greatest tools, and you start with this tool. But I quote what James Madison says: "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice," in other words, people we elect, "if the laws are so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood." And that's from Federalist 62. And what's happening is we have a runaway government that they do these monster laws, and then they're running to, when I visited the Hill with this Truth Act, the stories I heard were just unbelievable. They didn't have any way to search the laws. They didn't have any way to, let's say when they did amendments to the bill that was going forth, it was so voluminous, they didn't know really how to search it. And they could search a word, but if it wasn't the right word, it could have been sort of surreptitiously written under like another word. So no one knows what are in the bills. And the worst thing is the people don't know what are in the bills. It's very duplicitous. And so we did this bill. And if you see my Truth Act, so we can get off this page, I came up with an acronym, and this is what I thought Congress should do. The T stands for the bills should be 30 pages. And I learned when I was on the Hill, they should have a lot of it's in legal code. So they should interpret the legal code on the sides, and because the people need to be able to read these bills as well. It should be written on an easy level so the people that look up these bills can understand them. If you think about the Declaration of Independence, it was not written like a legalese. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was written so that people could understand it. And now they write bills that are completely in legal form that no one understands what it means. The bills need to be read by the legislators before they vote on it. U is that the bills are understood by the legislators before they vote on it. Now T, this didn't go over well on the Hill, but T, our congressmen and senators have to testify under oath before they before they vote on these bills, that they've read and understood the bills. They have to testify that they read it and they understand it before they vote on it. But the most important thing is H, that the American people have a chance to have this published and online. And I at one point thought all the senators should read it like via Zoom or YouTube, and that would be hilarious, because if they all had to sit there and read those long bills, it would just really prove the point, because it's hard to read 2 pages on camera. But we, the American people, need to hear it. The problem is if we hear that, but we can't understand it, or if it's so voluminous it cannot be even read on a YouTube type of situation, we have some real problems here. And so, interestingly enough, and I'm going to stop and ask questions, and I want Peter and Tova to ask questions. When we did this white paper, I just picked the number 30 out of the blue because I just thought 30, truth. It was an acronym. I knew the pages should be small. So when we did this white paper, and I think we have a graph for this, what was astonishing to me, looky here, everybody, okay? The Judiciary Act that established our courts was only 21 pages. The act that established uniform rules of naturalization, which was immigration, 2 pages. The National Banking Act of 1863, I'm trying to find that one, that established our national banking, okay, and currency, only 18 pages. If you go on to some of these other things, if you go to the Social Security Act, here we go. Okay, so I know you're thinking, oh, that was a long time ago. You know, of course, though, they were only 21 to 18 pages. Of course they were. But looky here. The Social Security Act of 1935 was only 30 pages. And we can go on here. It's not up there, but the Clean Air Act of 1863. So now we're up to 1863, just 10 pages. And then we go to the subsequent act, the Clean Water Act of 1972. Well, now it's going on to 88 pages. Okay. So it was fascinating to me to see that that's the laws that establish these major things in our country. The people read them, they can understand them, and look at the pages. Now go look what's happening. Look at this. No Child Left Behind, 670 pages. The 2007 federal budget, 1,418 pages. By the way, I've looked at them. They're in legalese. Like according to this law and this law, and you don't even know what the laws are. American Clean Energy Security Act of 2009, 1,428 pages. The Dodd-Frank Bill, 858 pages. And I cannot read what's under this little square here for the Affordable Care Act. So can you tell me what that number is, Lisa?
906 pages.
How many?
906.
Okay, yeah, well, that may what it ended up being. Originally, it was more like thousands and thousands of pages. So this was the really fascinating thing was we need to be able to understand what our legislators are doing, and they need to be able to understand what they're doing. And James Madison said this to us in this paper. And you know, I'll finish with Caligula was the Roman emperor, and he didn't want his people to know what the laws were, because then he had a lot of power and control over them. He could do whatever he wanted, and he could arrest them because they didn't know if they were doing anything wrong. And so he wrote the laws very high up on a Roman column so that the American people could not see them. And I think this is what's happening with our laws today. If we don't understand what they're doing, if we can't see them, then, you know, next thing you know, things have been established. It's just like Nancy Pelosi saying we have to pass it to find out what's in it. I mean, this is a horrible, terrible danger. So I'm actually going to turn this over to Tova for the first question. Tova, and then we'll go to Peter.
Right, so, I mean, going off of what you were saying, Janine, this is, I mean, very stark contrast, obviously, from the times when the Federalist Paper was written, when, you know, even back then they were complaining that the laws were too long, and that was when they were 30 pages, and now they are thousands. So I was wondering, why have they gotten this long? Like, what is what happened in between the 1700s and the, you know, 2000s that caused these laws to become so long? Like, what was the process of that? And other than, you know, sharing Janine's petition, is there anything we can do to try and understand these laws, or just like help us understand the reasons why this has become such a problem in American society?
Yeah, and I'll just step in there and hang on. I just want to say one thing. Tova, the bills were still small, as you just saw, right, in 1963. And even in 1972. So it's really been since the 70s and 80s when this got to be really out of control. Go ahead, Professor.
Well, first of all, I would note that John Marshall, and I can't remember, I think it was one of his famous decisions, either McCulloch v. Maryland or Marbury v. Madison, distinguished between a constitution, which was supposed to be relatively simple, brief language, and what he called a legal code, which would partake of prolixity. He expected legal codes to contain many, many pages. So in some sense, everyone always thought laws are going to be longer than constitutions or the Declaration. Our Constitution is a model of you know, the economy of words, whereas the EU Constitution, the Constitution of the European Union, is, you know, hundreds and hundreds of pages. So in some sense, the law has to be adequate to the phenomenon. And the question then is, what are you trying to legislate about? The other thing I would say, and this goes back for some time too, you want to know why laws are so long. It never hurts to start by blaming lawyers. You can blame lawyers for lots of different things, and lawyers are always fun to blame. And lawyers want to write things that are clear, in the sense of lawsuit proof. And that means that you have to try to anticipate in advance every possible way in which a clever attorney might attempt to exploit the law. So even if they're not self-dealing, even if they're not trying to sneak things in, they're trying to make their law lawyer-proof. And when lawyers are writing laws to be lawyer-proof, they're writing long laws. So I think part of it just has to do with the American legal culture, which Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s said was extremely litigious already in the 1830s. The other thing I'd go back to is what I said at the beginning, and that is the more you want, especially the federal government, to do, the more you want it to regulate every last aspect of our lives, the more detailed, the lengthier the laws are going to be. The way to attack this, it seems to me, if one wants to have shorter, more intelligible laws, is to demand less of the federal government and either leave people free to judge for themselves or have the regulations operate at a lower, perhaps simpler level where the phenomenon isn't necessarily as complex and is more easily grasped by the citizens on the ground.
Okay, well, that's not going to happen. We're going to have to come up with another solution other than that one, because that's just not going to happen, where suddenly this tank of government is going to just go, you know what, let's just, we don't need as much government anymore. That's just never going to happen, ever.
Well, then, I guess my response to that is, if you write short general laws, then and you're trying to regulate a complicated phenomenon, how do you apply the law, and who applies the law to the complicated phenomenon? And the answer, it seems to me then, is the federal bureaucracy. So the shorter the law, the more general, the more intelligible the law, it seems to me the more room there is for the bureaucracy to descend to the level of detail. And when that happens, all of a sudden you get regulations written that are even longer and more obscure than the law. And if you were to put the United States Code up against the Code of Federal Regulations, you'll discover that the Code of Federal Regulations is several orders of magnitude longer than the whole body of federal law. So maybe it's an insoluble problem, because as long as you want all this regulation to occur, the regs are going to be written somewhere. They're either written in Congress, and they're typically not written in Congress, and they're going to be written by the Environmental Protection Agency, by the Department of Homeland Security, by the Department of Education, by Health and Human Services, by Housing and Urban Development, by Securities and Exchange Commission, and so on. And we have even less, I mean, it's all transparent in the sense that if you want to, you can find it. But ordinary citizens, generally speaking, don't spend a lot of time poring over the Code of Federal Regulations, and they don't spend a lot of time.
Well, I think there are a lot of people that actually want to know, but they find it difficult to find, and they find it impossible to understand. And I guess what's happening here is unelected lawyers and bureaucrats are running the country instead of the people that we elect who are running the country, which is why they should write short bills and short laws that people can understand, so we can keep track of what's going on. Peter, what's going on? What do you think?
Well,
you want to?
I'm glad that you brought up the subject of regulation. Lawyers produce laws; it's what they do. Regulators produce regulations; it's what they do. There are those who have been critical of Congress for abandoning their lawmaking power to the executive branch in the writing of bills, long or short, by saying the relevant agencies shall come up with regulations to enforce what we've put in this law, basically abdicated their responsibility and given it to an unelected, let's call it a permanent government, people who are following what they believe to be the dictates and responsibilities of the agency they work for, and not to the people's representatives in Congress or to the President of the United States for whom they ultimately work. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the proper constitutional check on that kind of government excess, because the founders clearly, throughout all of the Federalists, were focused importantly on the idea of maximizing personal freedom by limiting and enumerating the powers of the federal government and keeping it essentially in a box out of which it should not have broken, but appears to have at this point.
Well, Peter, you're preaching to the choir there. I think the grant of power to the federal government in the Constitution is a limited grant of power. If you look at Article 1 begins, all legislative powers herein granted, which implies there are legislative powers that are not herein granted. There are things that the Congress cannot legislate, and it's not just the explicit limitations in Article 1 or in the Bill of Rights, but anything Congress isn't explicitly given the power to do is reserved either to the states or to the people. So we would expect, much of the legislation, the so-called use of the police power, this the power to legislate regarding the health, welfare, safety, and morals of the people, was reserved to the states. I had a very interesting conversation with my daughter's now former college roommate, who was a student from France studying here in the US. And she asked me when she was staying with us when their campus shut down in March, why is it up to mayors and governors to deal with this COVID crisis? And I said, we have the police power as we understand it is very different from the way it's understood in France. Police power in France is at the center and delegated to the localities. The center controls everything. In our country, the police power, dealing with, in this case, the health and safety of the people, largely resides in states and localities. That's where it should reside. If you had a limited federal government, you would, first of all, not have as big a bureaucracy as you now have, and certainly it would be easier to keep tabs on. Yes, there would be regulatory and legal issues at the state level, but that's much more accessible. I can track down and have tracked down and run into my state legislator at a local Starbucks. My member of Congress is a little harder to get a hold of, and certainly wouldn't know who I am and wouldn't remember my name. So, for me, the problem is how much the federal government is doing. And if it's impossible to get the federal government to do less, then I'm not necessarily prepared to give up on that long-term persuasive struggle. If that's impossible, then I'm not sure what the solution is, because writing short laws simply leaves more for the bureaucracy to do.
And it's also true, if I may, it's also true that a short law can be a bad law.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Women may not drive cars during the day. That's a short law. It would be a bad one. It would violate constitutional protections of presumptions of equality.
The good news about a short law like that is that we'd figure out it's a bad law and be able to, vote out of office the people who enacted it.
Do you think that there's a relationship then between clarity and clarity of intent and reelection? the obfuscation that's occurring that Janine has talked about in these very long bills that some of us have read is deliberate and designed to prevent the American people from knowing what the mechanisms of their government are doing?
I think in some cases it's that. In some cases, I think it's I think the likelier causes are the overambition of government, the kind of assumption that they think they know better than we do what's good for us. And I think it's also, as I said earlier, the effort on the part of very clever lawyers to try to defend what they've produced against other very clever lawyers, and to give me something that they regard as legally airtight. And in some sense, I have to appreciate that. Problem is, if I don't understand the legally airtight thing, or I have to employ an attorney to understand the legally airtight thing, then we have a problem. And in some respects, you could say, yeah, the big issue is that right now we have laws made by lawyers. And if we had laws made by ordinary people, so to speak, perhaps we'd have simpler laws. I think.
Well, I'll jump in because I just reminded something that Thomas Jefferson said. And Thomas Jefferson believed that when a bill was proposed, it should stay out for a year for all of the American people to peruse it, read it, look at it, think about what they wanted to vote with it, talk to their representatives, and then there was a vote. So, of course, government's become so huge and the country's become so big that's not possible now. But none of our founders expected bills to be so big that the American people could not understand them. Not to imagine, and written in such a voluminous way in legalese, and none of our founders expected our representatives to vote on bills that they haven't read, that they're just going from a political aspect, as George Washington says, that the political parties will be the downfall of our country because you care more about your political party than about being an American. And so they're just, and they go down to the Senate floor and say to their aides, how am I supposed to vote on this? None of our founders wanted that to happen. They didn't want us to not be able to know what's in the bills, and they didn't want our legislators and senators to vote on bills that they didn't know what was in it. And they certainly didn't want lawyers, unelected lawyers, to be writing the bills that we don't even elect. So, we can go back and forth. And Professor, you've made some really, really great points. Peter, you too, and Tova. But I mean, the bottom line is the country's completely out of control. And, when I walked this on the Hill, there were quite a few senators and quite a few representatives that were thanking me, that were looking at me saying, we don't know what to do with these bills. They're so big. The own legislators. And there were some that actually sent me letters saying that they're proposing the exact same thing. And what they're trying to do now is they're trying to take bills, instead of being 1,000 pages, they vote on shorter increments of what they're talking about. So they don't put 7 different instances in one bill. They break it down, and this is this particular, not an omnibus type of bill. This is what we're going to talk about now. And they started to do more like 100 pages and chop things up, so everything's not thrown into one bill and they become so big. But none of our founders wanted this to happen.
No,
Tova,
I agree with you, and I think it has.
I'm gonna let Tova ask a question. Go ahead,
Okay.
Tova.
Oh, sure. Well, this is all a very fascinating question, but I was wondering if we could go back into the more historical context of this Federalist Paper. And, as we know, the Federalist Papers were written to advocate for a new U.S. Constitution and addressing some of the flaws in the Articles of Confederation. So I was wondering, was there any specific flaw in the Articles of Confederations that this paper was written to kind of address and bring to light? And if so, how was that remedied in what became the U.S. Constitution?
Well, I don't think in particular Federalist 62 was addressing a problem in the Articles of Confederation. I can say a few things about what was wrong with, from their point of view, the Articles of Confederation. The big thing that was wrong was that the central government had too little power. They wanted it to be adequate to its responsibilities, and under the Articles, it wasn't adequate to its responsibilities. The legislators in the Congress under the Articles of Confederation understood themselves as, we might call them, ambassadors from their states. And it was hard to get a substantial enough majority to enact anything, and the federal government had no power to compel the states to do what it said they should do. So states could opt out of the law if they wanted to. They didn't have to pay their share of the revenues, and so on and so on and so on. So they thought that the United States government under the Articles of Confederation was an impotent embarrassment. You had to give the federal government some power. It had to be enough power to live up to its limited responsibilities. They didn't want to make it responsible for everything. They just wanted to make it powerful enough to do what it was supposed to do. The Senate certainly acknowledges the old federal nature of our union by saying states are represented as states in the Senate. Each state has equal voice in the Senate, 2 senators. And until 1913, those senators were elected by state legislatures. So they really did understand themselves as spokespeople for their states. Now they just understand themselves as representatives of the state electorate, less concerned about protecting, the bailiwick of the states and the realm of state authority. And if the people of a particular state happen to want the federal government to do a lot of stuff, the senator from, let's say, Illinois is not going to say, well, I really think Illinois ought to be doing this, even though my people want the federal government to do this. When the state legislature was doing the electing, that senator might say, well, my first constituency is the state legislature, which is the state government. And if the state government says, we want to handle this problem, then that's a different story. So I think in general terms, they wanted a government that was limited, but a government that was capable of doing what it was supposed to do within those limits. And that's what they didn't get under the Articles, and that's what they thought they were getting under the new Constitution.
Janine, you're on mute.
You brought up an interesting point. Thank you, Tova. You brought up an interesting point, Professor, about how they before the 17th Amendment, which said that the people would vote for the Senate instead of the states voting for sending their senators, that they would be concerned about what their state wanted first and foremost. And what's interesting about that is it goes back to that correlation of your guest from France not understanding everything on a federal nature. How I've been fascinated by it, and I think it's the way it should be, that police is local, deciding what to do about your COVID outbreak is local. It's been a real example during all these crises of 2020 to see the local government work and how important that really is. That you don't want a national guard going into little tiny communities across the country where they don't know any of the people, they don't know how to react to the people. Very important that the people within the state and their own communities have their own people trying to help with the situation. And so it's really, when the 17th Amendment happened, that all changed, where they didn't care about that crucial element in our government, which left a lot of the governing to the actual state and to the actual people. And I think we've seen during this how important that has been, because every state has wanted to do things their own way. And they had, New Yorkers didn't want someone from, Georgia telling them what to do, and Georgia didn't want someone from Seattle telling them what to do. It's really interesting, and in a way it keeps peace in the country, that the states and the local governments are able to do what they want to do, because the country's so big. We're kind of like all these individual little countries, and it really is a shame that they took away that protection of local government with the 17th Amendment. Peter, go ahead.
Since we're
on mute.
talking about the 17th Amendment, the repeal of which is on my bucket list, which I want to see it abolished or rescinded before I go off to meet my maker, because it broke the vertical separation of powers that the founders intended to exist between the federal government and the states. But looking forward, there is a movement now, and since we're talking about Federalist 62, There is a movement now among some progressives to want to abolish the Senate altogether. That it is somehow, in their minds, it is somehow illegitimate to have a geographically based legislative body rather than one that's based on population as the House of Representatives is. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on the arguments that Madison makes for the Senate in Federalist 62 that would refute what some of the progressives are saying today.
Well, many of Madison's arguments are based on the federal character of the Union. And I will defend that federal character to the hilt, in the sense that I think it still matters. I think as a practical matter, the Senate will never be abolished, simply because there are too many votes in the Senate from small states and too many senators from small states who do not want to be governed, and I'm going to put this very crudely, by the two coasts. So I think as a practical matter, it's dead in the water. So I'm not so concerned that the Senate is going to be abolished. I do think it's important to try to teach people that efficiency and a kind of abstract fairness are not the principal concerns of the Constitution. One of the concerns is federalism, which means that the rule for people in Mississippi may be different than the rule for the people in New York, and we shouldn't have a problem with that. I don't think the 17th Amendment does away with that. I think it, in some ways, too simplifies the Constitution and helps obscure something that's still there, which is it's a limited grant of power to the federal government. Much of the powers is reserved for the states, and you're right. This is our experience with COVID has been a good object lesson about the importance of state and local government. And I just saw some polling data. I didn't read the article. I just saw the headline that people trust their governors and mayors more than they trust the federal government when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. And I think our governors and mayors ought to take that and run with it. Some of them can't run very far because their records aren't good. And I certainly hope that they don't succeed in deflecting blame from themselves to the federal government over this, and it's always easy to do. But I do think that we've had a spotlight shown on the importance of state and local government, and some of our state and local officials have risen to the challenges, others haven't. I think it's valuable, and we should certainly shout that from the rooftops and emphasize over and over again the grant of power to the federal government is limited. The states have principal responsibility for the health, safety, welfare, and morals of the people. And if you legislate at the state level, you're going to have somewhat simpler, more accessible legislation. When you try to put together a package at the federal level, problem is you have so many different interests that you have to broker. Janine was talking about chopping the bills up into smaller bits. Part of the problem with that is, what interest do I have in voting for your bit if I can't be certain you're going to vote for my bit? And one of the reasons why the laws get complicated is the necessity of building these electoral coalitions. If we had straight up and down party government, in the sense that it's something more like a parliamentary system, perhaps you could have simpler legislation because you wouldn't have to have something in there for everyone. But when you have the kind of complicated legislative process we have, to get enough votes to get the bill through, you may have to provide something for everyone. And that then depends on the character and quality of the legislators. And we have to, I suppose, hold them accountable to be to care not just about, my pocketbook here in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, but also about the good of the people on the plains, the good of the people in the Northeast, Southwest, and so on. And
well, I think the bills, to interrupt because we're running out of time here, I think the bills that usually are voted on are bills that would affect the country on a federal level. I don't think they're voting on a bill in Washington, D.C., on the federal government up there in Washington, D.C., that's just going to affect Atlanta. I mean, a bill, or Georgia, a bill that's going to just affect Georgia would just be taking place in Georgia on the state government level. So I don't think that there are laws that just take place for one state that are happening. Anything that they federally pass is going to federally affect the entire country. I've never seen them pass a bill where they say, this bill that the United States government just passed is just for Texas. So,
No.
I think that founding, and I want Tova to ask a question. I think our founding fathers were very adamant that we keep these things short, but also that, if you want something that's for a particular, they wanted representatives of integrity, that if they're doing a federal bill, and they don't have to get their pork or their earmark in order to pass something and play those kind of political games. It should be, should be what's best for the country as a whole. And we've had this party system that's just destroyed everything. But if it's a bill that's just going to affect Georgia, then it's just going to take place in Georgia. Go ahead, Tova.
Well, I think it's interesting, just as a comment, that we've been talking a lot about how important it is to have laws be made on a more state and local basis, because, as you were mentioning, Janine, with COVID, we've seen that, it's important to be able to tailor, laws and actions to the specific area. But I find it interesting that most people actually don't know what's happening at the state level. They know what's happening at the national level. They know what's in the news. They know what's happening with everything that, the president does, or a lot of what the national legislature does, but they actually don't know what's happening on the local level or on the state level as much. And that's one thing that I think we've discussed a lot with Constituting America, but how important it is to get involved, both voting and just staying informed on the local level, because that's like as important, if not more important, than what's happening on a national level. So I guess the question is, why do you think that people are so fixated on what's happening in the national government, whereas we see a lack of interest or information on what's happening on the local level? And do you think that should change?
Well, I think it depends largely on where you sit. I would bet that your parents pay an awful lot of attention to local school issues, local property tax issues, local traffic issues, and so on. When you have responsibilities, when you're a homeowner and so on, when you have children, you pay an awful lot of attention to the things that directly impact your family, your livelihood, your pocketbook, and so on. So I think it is true that it's very easy for some of us, especially to the degree that we don't have those kinds of concrete local responsibilities that come with being parents, being homeowners, and so on, to fixate on the big kind of gaudy and very energizing, national issues. So, I can care an awful lot about a big social issue, but when they're going to put or not put a stoplight on a street corner near me, when they're going to build an apartment complex or a very dense neighborhood that's going to generate lots more traffic near me, believe me, my neighbors and I get involved. I live next door to a big highway that they're going to do some work to, and there was a town hall about that a few months ago, and virtually everyone from my neighborhood was there because it directly affects us. If I'd held a meeting about, some kind of abstract national issue, I might have gotten a few people there, and there'd be people, political junkies like you would be there. I'm sorry if you're not, but let's just assume you are. People like you, people like me would be there, but most of my neighbors wouldn't. But when we talk about what's going to happen in the local school, what are we going to do about traffic in the neighborhood? Different story altogether. A lot of energy.
Professor, I like that. Town halls I think are so incredibly wonderful, where people come together and have their town halls. I've been to many. I don't know, Tova, if you've actually been to one yet, but town halls are so cool. And I love the way they were portrayed on Northern Exposure. And that's exactly, too bad we can't have federal town halls, but we try to, I guess. Peter, we have about 5 minutes left, so you have the last closing sort of remarks as well as a last question.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I was just answering one of the questions in the chat room. Somebody wanted to know why it's not required that the legislation proposed be read out loud before debate begins. And I was explaining that actually is a requirement. It's in the rules of both chambers, but it's also the case that each chamber may vote to waive that requirement before proceeding to debate. And that's often what occurs. Professor Knippenberg, this has been a fantastic.
Wait. I find that really interesting. They're required to read the bills by what? A Senate law, a legislative law?
The rules of the House and the Senate require that the clerk read the bill before it can be introduced for debate, but they can vote to waive that requirement, and most often do.
Oh, so that's that. Look at that right there. That's fascinating to know. Just look at that. Look at that. They don't want it to sit up there and read, 965 pages. They don't want it to sit up there and read 7,000 pages. And so they vote to not read it to the people. I think that's terrible. I think that needs to be changed. That's horrible that they vote to not read that there's a, I wonder when was that put in place, that bill to say they're required to read it.
Professor Knippenberg may know differently than I, but I think that's been there since the beginning.
It would not shock me if it has been. I don't know any better than you do.
So that's something Jefferson would have wanted in our founders. I was right. I was saying our founders would never want this to happen. And so they require that it be read, and they don't read it today. Fascinating to know. We need to fight for that. We need to say you must, and then, guess what? If suddenly they have to read it to the American people, they're not going to be 600, 700, 500, 7,000, 1,000 pages long. If they were required
yet,
to
there
do
would be
it.
no laws, because it would take so much time to read them that they wouldn't get around to actually enacting them. And that's probably a better solution than just making them read them, or the blessing that comes from making them read them.
If they kept it down to 30 pages, they could read it. And if they kept it down to even 100 pages, they could read it. And this is what's wrong with our country, and I stand by this. That I had a senator say that to me, something very similar in regard to Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, which is, every treaty has to be approved by the Senate, ratified by the Senate. He's like, oh, there are so many, we just don't have time. So they changed the name of it and call it a senatorial, they call it an executive agreement, so that it doesn't have to be ratified. And all that is wrong. All of this is wrong. All of this is where we're asleep at the wheel, and we're not holding our people accountable because we don't know what's in the Constitution. That's why we launched Constituting America. If you understand what they're doing, that they're changing the name of treaties to an executive agreement, and they have magically a little behind the scenes change things. Same thing with this. How many people in America know? I want to know where that is, Peter. How many people in America know that the bills are supposed to be read on the floor before they're voted on, and they're not doing it? Can you figure that out, Peter? I want to know.
I believe it's in the House, the rules of the House and the rules of the Senate.
Fascinating.
Sounds right to me.
We're gonna have to figure that out. Okay, enough. Go ahead. 2 minutes.
Generally speaking, though, there's an enormous pessimism out there right now that I think is being fed by many of my media colleagues, that the nation is at a tipping point. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the Constitution and our constitutional system?
That's a hard question. I don't have a ready answer to that. I think
that's why I asked it.
I think it's hard to change, and I think that's a good thing. I think that the temptation on the part of especially the impatient people is to try to dispense with it altogether. And the good news there is I think most of us would rather keep the Constitution than dispense with it. And I suppose my optimism comes from the fact that I think the opponents of the Constitution and the opponents of our current system of government will very likely overreach and bring the rest of us to our senses. And therein lies, I think, an opportunity for those who've been and remain faithful constitutionalists to pick up the pieces and offer the sober insight and knowledge when the partisans of radical change have discovered the limits of the people's willingness to go along with them.
Thank you so much for bringing enlightenment to us today and to giving us perspectives on this to think about. We really appreciate you very, very much. And I'm glad we were able to have a free-flowing conversation today that was able to go in many different directions, because that's what's interesting. So I thank you so much, Professor.